Americans, an organization dedicated to supporting the families of missing Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest. She's Puyallup and Nisqually and works for the Puyallup Tribe Community Domestic Violence Advocacy Program. Thank you so much for speaking with me, Carolyn DeFord.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. The organization that you founded, I know that this was founded really based off of a personal narrative of yours that really inspired it. So can you kind of describe what inspired you to start the organization and the events that led up to it?
I started in 2017, was an official, everything kind of slowly morphed into this organization of volunteers. My mom went missing in October 1999. My mom was Leona Lee Claire Kinsey. She's Puyallup and Nisqually. And she went to meet a friend, a man named John, somebody who she thought was a friend. She went to meet him at the grocery store, or that's what she said. So we don't even really know if she made it to the grocery store. We just know that she said she was going to the store to meet John, and she told her friend she would be over as soon as she was done, and she never showed up. And so the next day her friend called and was really concerned that my mom hadn't showed up and she wasn't at home, and she checked around town for her, and it was a small town, only about 10,000, 13,000 people, and she couldn't find my mom anywhere, and wanted to know if by chance did she come up here, and my hometown, La Grande, Oregon, is only it's about 6 hours away. I had small children, so it was 9 hours away. But she just was thinking, did something happen? Did she come up there to see you? And I hadn't heard from her, and my mom was pretty independent anyway. We didn't have cell phones, so it was really hard to keep in touch all the time. If your car broke down or something, you had to wait for access to a phone. You couldn't just text people. And I can't even imagine anymore what that was like, but we survived.
Right.
And so I wasn't real surprised. My mom was pretty independent, and if something had come up and an emergency happened or her car broke down or something, then there must be a good explanation. So I didn't panic. It wasn't unusual to not have regular communication because we didn't have cell phones.
Right.
And so I kind of humored her and said, okay, I'll call her, and so I tried calling her, she didn't answer, and she had a pager, and I paged her, and she never responded, and up until late that night I was trying to get a hold of her, and then I was starting to get mad, dang it, call me back, I'm busy, I'm done with this, call me. And so I had told her, one of the kids is in the hospital, I need you to call me, and it wasn't like my mom to not answer my calls. I was an only child, and I lived away from home, and she had 3 small grandchildren that she adored, and so if I called her, she called. We didn't have that kind of angst, where she wouldn't return my call, and by noon the next day I was really panicking. Okay, so I told her there's an emergency, and I begged her, Mom, call me, it's an emergency, one of the kids is sick, and she didn't answer, and I again, her friend was like, I think you need to call and make a missing persons report, something's wrong, I know something's wrong, and so I did, and I was really in disbelief, no, there's got to be a good explanation, there's got to be an answer, and I didn't want to call the police. One, I didn't want to believe, I couldn't make myself believe something had happened, and you've heard that distrust between tribal communities and law enforcement.
Yes, absolutely.
And so my mom very much, she spent a lot of her youth on the reservation, and she had a major distrust with with law enforcement, and if she'd known that I was preparing to call the police, she would have, you know, you just don't do that. You know, you don't do that unless it's a matter of life and death, and we take care of our own problems and we'll be just fine, and that's it. And so I was really afraid to call and make that missing persons report, knowing that she would stay out of my business, you know, leave me alone. I'm a grown adult. I can take care of myself, and whatever you do, don't call the police about, you know, I didn't come home and you called the police, you know.
Right.
And I kind of felt really childish, like kind of had those feelings of being home alone when I was little and not knowing what to do and when are they going to be back, you know. And I had to suck it up and say, nope, if you don't want me to call the police, then you should have answered my call, you know. And in hindsight, I'm glad I did, but it was really scary, you know. And so for a lot of families, I put myself in that place again. Like, by the time you have analyzed every scenario and have been, you know, and are desperate enough to involve the police, that needs to be taken into consideration, you know. Like, this is, for a lot of people, this is the last resort. It's not cry wolf, it's not, I don't know where they're at and I'm just going to call the police. It's that all of our resources have been exhausted. And that there was a big disillusionment. I was pretty young. I was only 25 and I was awfully naive. I had a lot of faith and belief in, I guess, in my hometown, you know, my little hometown police department who cared about the community to find her. Like, maybe some unreal expectations too, as far as, you know, they're going to find a fingerprint and hair and somebody's going to have seen something and they'll find her, you know. And I just thought I'd file the report and they'd be like, we found her, she's on her way home, you know. And that wasn't necessarily the case, you know. I thought they'd search her house. I thought there'd be like search parties. I thought they'd plaster the town in the news and the newspaper with posters, and a reward would just automatically show up. And I thought she'd be important. I thought she'd be found. And it's really disillusioning because it's not what happens for the majority of our people. So I had that major, like, disappointment, disillusionment, like, reality check, kind of put in my place as to how naive I was, and I still am. I'm still a benefit of the doubter, you know. I see the good in stuff before I see the worst. And
do you think that there's, due to, I don't know, so it sounds like tribal people in general are like, that's their last ditch resort, is to reach out to the police, at least like the federal police. Is that something that's like pretty common, or like within all tribes? In my
experience, it's pretty common.
Gotcha.
I can't speak for everybody, but the people that I do know and I've talked to, it's definitely the majority. And there's a lot of factors to that, you know. There's a lot of variables that play into that, and a long history of mistrust to outside agencies and that kind of thing. You know, my mom disappeared off of the reservation, so she is one of those, you know, the urban Indian, which, you know, I grew up off of the reservation, so I never really felt this division that we have, you know, closer in to tribal communities. And you know, my mom is Native and my dad's white, and I'm pretty light skinned, so I fit in and could live in that world pretty easily, you know. I didn't deal with a lot of that discrimination that a lot of other people would deal with just based on the color of my skin. And I think so so my views of my experiences with racism and that kind of part of it are not the same as other people's, because I haven't lived that experience. But when my mom went missing, I was suddenly extremely alone and extremely lost, and I had no idea what to do or where to begin, and all these things that I had thought that the police would do after a certain period of time. I thought...
You mentioned previously that there's no formal grieving process. There's no ceremony, which I know is really important to a large aspect of your culture, and that is just never experienced. So I guess, have you allowed yourself to kind of ever quit looking, or does that feeling of ambiguous loss still is that still pretty present for you?
It's funny, I think my journey, it's been 20 years.
Right.
And for the first 4 years or so, 5 years, 6 years, it was very surface level still. I still had hope. Yeah, I knew, I knew my mom would never, ever leave her precious dog. Her good kid. I used to joke, she'd joke that this is the good kid. And she would never leave her dog. She would never leave me. She would never leave her grandkids. She just wouldn't. Nothing in the world could keep her away, and I knew something happened to her. The only thing that would stand between that would be death. And I also really spiritually felt her. And then there came a time when I think I just survived.
Right.
And there wasn't an audience to hear about her. There wasn't a movement. I didn't know what to do other than survive. And I kind of buried it, for a long time. And just over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been, it's always been an easy trigger. Anytime someone goes missing and you live through that story, or watching, I still won't watch Law and Order or NCIS or anything like that. I just get mad. Like, it's not how it works, You don't find people that easy. You never solve the crime. So I don't watch that stuff because it makes me mad. I don't watch 48 Hours or, America's Most Wanted or Unsolved Mysteries. I can't watch that stuff because I imagine her
right
in that, and I imagine it, and
And why? Because the most tragic part about this story is that, as you said yourself, it's pretty typical. There are so many people, women especially, and urban indigenous women who go missing, every year. So why is this so underreported? Why isn't it picked up by the media? Why is it, a huge crisis with just very little spotlight?
Gosh, I think there's a lot of factors to that too. With my mom's case, she was in a small town in eastern Oregon, really, really rural. So her local newspaper picked it up, but it never got far from there. And she's probably it's been 20 years, and she's been in the paper, I'll be really generous and say maybe 6 times, but I think it's more like 4. And even to this day, they did an article, a series on unsolved crimes 3 years ago, and she was included in that series. And I asked her detective to see if the paper would do something for her 20-year, the 20-year disappearance, and just call on the community for information. And the newspaper said no, that it had been too soon.
What?
But they did an article on her 3 years ago, and it was just too soon.
Wow.
So, so that was my hometown experience. But I think, if we were to look at all of the missing persons cases that happen across the country, only a small portion of any of them get shared. But when you look at a set, a certain population who maybe they're on reservations, they have a tribal paper that comes out once a month.
Right.
Or it might get shared, a youth might get shared in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or their missing person might get put on the federal, missing persons list, or in NCIC, but we're really noticing that it's those grassroots voices and the advocacy of organizations like mine, Missing and Murdered Native Americans, Lost and Missing in Indian Country, MMIW USA, Indian Countries Missing, these grassroots organizations that are really doing a lot more of the groundwork and getting the information out there through social media and in the community and in the papers, and the thousands of people that go missing every day. We don't hear about hardly any of them, but we rarely hear about a Native person going missing.
And that's the most disturbing part to me is, I know that Seattle sits right now as the top city with missing Indigenous people, or women especially. But there's a huge disparity between what's the name of the database? NICI, I think? NCIC. There's a huge disparity between NCIC and then what's actually registered, like with the Federal Police Department, because I think we have like 26 versus there's upwards of 90 that are on NCIC that are actually missing. So I guess, what do you think? I don't know, it's harder to kind of phrase my question, but the disparity between, I guess, tribal law is what I'm picking up, and the federal, how they're just not working together at federal law level, is that kind of what I'm picking up? I guess House Bill 2951 is supposed to kind of reconcile that, isn't it, a little bit?
That's the idea.
That's the idea. Mm-hmm. How effective do you think? I know that was a big deal to get House Bill 2951 passed, and it probably is a step in the right direction. But do you think that's going to be enough to actually create the transparency that there needs to be really in these different channels?
No.
House
Bill 2951 is good, and it's a good step in the right direction, and the intentions behind it are good. But there was 8 meetings across the state, right? 8 community meetings across the state, and how those invitations were sent to the people who needed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there might have been some gaps in that communication, because a lot of our tribal leaders got an invitation to a community meeting, and our tribal leaders are leaders of sovereign nations.
Right.
They're government leaders of tribal nations, and so they're really busy, and maybe that invitation needed to be extended on a more formal level to the leaders of sovereign nations, not to the community members of those, not to a community meeting.
Wow, so there's a huge lack of recognition there, even of the status that they hold within their own governments, or almost even a lack of recognition of the government.
In some
ways,
cases,
a little bit.
Yeah, like we know that it's an Indian tribe, but it's almost like we look at it like an HOA or something.
Yeah.
So I wonder about that. I wasn't included in those communications, but from the few leaders that I've been able to talk to, the intention of that community meeting and the intention of exactly what data needed to be collected and how and when and what they specifically wanted was really vague. And so I'm curious to see the study, and if they got the results that they needed, and what the responses were from the tribes, because tribes are sovereign nations. The only entity that has the authority to pass legislation and pass legislation over these sovereign nations is Congress. So for our state to come and say, hey, we want these numbers, it's almost like the child telling the babysitter it's time for bed,
Right.
It's I don't know that that went well. So I'm really curious to see those numbers and see how it went. Kind of get feedback on the study and what could have what could have happened, should have happened, and do we still have time to fill those gaps and get responses. Conducting the study is a huge step, and I think maybe it will show us more of what we don't know than what we do know. One of the things is, the lack of accurate reporting of race.
Right.
So
and the default to white, that must be like, wow, what a comment right there, really.
Or even the default of East Indians, immigrants and citizens in the United States who are from India, being reported as American missing. Let's say we'll use the city of Tacoma. If I were to go missing in the city of Tacoma, and I don't have my tribal ID on me, maybe they'll classify me as white. Maybe my family member will report me missing or something like that, and it will be accurate, and they'll show that I'm Native. Maybe they don't even care to double check the box. My mom was reported as white for 18 years.
Oh my gosh.
So whether or not, where that ball is getting dropped on law enforcement's end, we don't know. Is it that the families aren't given the opportunity to audit and verify that missing persons report for accuracy? That they're rushing through it because they're short-staffed and under-resourced to be able to dedicate the time and the attention that it needs to be done properly. But, so let's say I go missing in Tacoma. You can't ask my tribe for that information, whether, how many people are missing, because if I go missing in Tacoma, nobody tells my tribe. Who tells, maybe my family will tell my tribe, but not all do, and not all think about it. And especially if I'm married, outside of that, my married family, my in-laws, my husband, they might not think to tell my tribe, that, hey, she's,
right,
tribal member is missing. And so our tribes don't even know all of their individuals that are missing.
Wow. It's like these two, communities, and people are just falling right through the middle.
Mm-hmm. So we check a box that says that we're Native American, but there's 29 tribes in Washington. Which one of those am I?
You mean there's not even tribal specification?
Mm-mm.
Wow.
So NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, just put in a section in their form where you could put tribal affiliation now. So that's one of the first that I know of where they're trying to collect that data, but NamUs is optional. I think there's a couple law enforcement agencies in the country that make it practice or have policy to use NamUs, but it's not a law, it's not required, yet it's funded by the Department of Justice. But it's not a requirement for municipal law enforcement to enter missing people into NamUs. And so we have kind of that gap too.
Right.
So nobody knows, there's a list of missing people that are all Native American, but I could be Navajo in Washington, and who's going to tell my tribe?
That's so crazy, because that's just kind of, you were talking previously about how you kind of just assumed things would work a certain way, like you just call and then there's a face on a poster with reward under it. I always just kind of assume that if you go missing, because I am aware that we have sovereign nations in the U.S., that there would just be, a spot to check for tribal affiliation. Like, that just seems like a no-duh addition to a piece of paperwork. Yeah. Like, that's just crazy to me.
Yeah, or that there's a spot on there for the family or for the reporting person to list family members or maybe any tribal descendancy that they're aware of.
Or really any of, some girl goes missing, they'll mention that she's a Chi Omega, any sort of affiliations. Like, that's ridiculous. That just, the injustice of that makes me so mad. Is there any sort of, do you know if there's any sort of jurisdiction or movement to try and get NamUs to be mandatory?
We included that in the resolution for the AT&I when we how when the AT&I acknowledged the Day of Awareness,
Mm-hmm.
Within that it did encourage tribal, city, state, law enforcement agencies to report all missing Native people in NamUs within 30 days. And it's Tennessee did pass legislation within their Missing Persons Act that required entering all people into NamUs.
I would not expect that, actually, for them to be the more progressive state.
It's funded by the federal government. It should be mandatory.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Wow.
It's a free service.
There aren't even any barriers to entry then. It's not like it's not affordable.
Right.
That just seems like one of those, easy mm-hmm. win, no duh.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that I had was, in your work, have you seen, at what rate, I guess, has there been more disappearances lately, less? Is it staying about the same? I just think it's really interesting that Seattle is the highest in terms of missing Indigenous women. Do you have any guesses as to why that is, or whether it's slowing down or speeding up?
I have seen it increase. I haven't done any studies to know the rate, but definitely we see more people reporting their loved ones missing, more families trying their search on their own before they've done a missing persons report, confusion about, is there a waiting period to do a missing persons report? If they're over 18, they have the right to go missing. That was one of the things that law enforcement said to me was, well, she's over 18, she has a right to go missing. So that was kind of their she didn't lead a normal schedule. They couldn't say that every day she'd be at this point at 8:15 and she'd be at work. She'd walk through the door at work at 9 and she'd take lunch at noon. They couldn't keep a normal schedule. And since she was over 18 and had the right to manage her own life and go missing if she wanted, they didn't search for her. And some places and people would say she's over 18, she has a right to go missing, and they, want to do a mandatory 24-hour, 48-hour waiting period before they'll take your missing persons report. So I think a lot of families are really afraid of that and start their search on their own too and get the ball rolling initially, and maybe even just getting the word out in the community so that they come home,
Right.
So that they know people are looking for them. And we've seen a big increase, and I think we've also seen a lot of people coming home, a lot of people being found and reunited, and a lot of that is due to social media. Statistically, if you look at the numbers in NCIC, 2017 had over 10,000. I was going to try and do the exact number, but over 10,000 missing Native Americans. Almost over 8,000 of them were under the age of 18.
Oh, wow.
In 2017. And then in 2018, it was almost 10,000 missing Native Americans, and only 7,400 of them were over 18 that are active, that were actively missing that year.
Wow.
So the numbers have gone down as far as NCIC and what's being reported into our federal databases, but again, tribes aren't required to report that information annually, and in a lot of places, the information that gets put into there, some of it is optional.
Right.
I think we've seen a lot more human trafficking, and a lot more of those kind of cases too. And so I think maybe just the more that we're hearing about it kind of on a grassroots level, doesn't really add up with those numbers that NCIC is sharing, but it's definitely showing more awareness within our communities and within, population as a whole.
And in terms of women going missing from reservations versus rather those that have moved off, do you think that, being separated from the culture, which kind of is supposed to be what's on the reservation, do you think that makes women more vulnerable? Like, is there a greater level of vulnerability to be outside of it?
Absolutely. Like, we were just talking about how tight our communities are. There was a study, I think it was the GOA. I always get the acronym wrong. The GOA. There have been a lot of studies that talk about the preventive and protective factors of community and culture. So when you're within your community and it's a healthy community and you're involved in cultural activities and within your extended family structures and doing those things that are that good medicine, there's more protection, more protective factors, more protection, less outside influences. So definitely we're safer within that. Outside of the reservation, our urban relatives who live far from access to cultural resources and activities, I think they're definitely more vulnerable. That's they're missing out on so many things that can help to kind of surround them in community.
Right.
I can't remember the study that it was, but it was talking about the healing power of culture. Have you heard that term before?
I have, yeah.
Power of culture. And community, the importance of community. And you think about little kids, and when our children are little, we surround them in community. Like they get to go to, they're going to Sunday school and T-ball and this and that. And, they're surrounded with people who are watching out for them and care for them. And as they get older, that community gets wider and wider and further. And they're susceptible to more harm. So we know community is protective, and preventive, and culture is hugely preventive. So those are major things that our urban Indians are missing, that it gives them an extra vulnerability. Within that phrase, like I've heard the healing power of culture, but I read a quote, and I can't quote it verbatim, but I'll summarize it. And it was, you can only heal indigenous wounds and indigenous trauma with indigenous medicine and indigenous healing.
Oh.
And I thought about that and read it and thought about it, and I thought how true that is, that the issues that are happening within tribal communities and to indigenous populations really can only be healed through those things that connect to your spirit, that connect you on a human level. And if you've never felt it before, it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain to outside if you've never felt that kind of spirit healing. Traditionally, our warriors, right? Our hunters, they brought back they brought back major food supplies. They were hunters and gatherers and warriors and protectors and teachers and they had their role and their purpose in the community as providers, and we're losing those traditional providers. We're losing those mentors and role models and teachers for our young men. And so what happens when we have young men who aren't learning how to grow up and how to treat their mother and how to treat their spouse and their partners and how to treat each other and how to solve conflicts without violence, and how to have enough confidence to be able to do that, and who's teaching those young men and those boys that if we're losing our men and we're losing our women to love them and heal them and hold the standard of what a woman should be treated like, that women are sacred and life givers, and that our children are gifts from Creator, and the special role that our men play in that. We're people of balance.
Right.
We're people of balance and equality, where none is more valuable than any other, and as we lose our these bits of our community, what's left is young ones growing up without those teachings, and without that culture, removed and hurt. What does trauma do? We know about ACE scores, but what does trauma do? Even to any of us at any age, but to our children who are growing up seeing this happen.